Hi, my name is Mathias Sivertsen and I work at Åsane Upper Secondary School in Bergen, Norway. I teach English and Norwegian both at the regular school and in Bjørgvin prison, where I primarily teach in the Juvenile Unit. I have been asked to talk about how we, the teachers, work with motivating young inmates for schoolwork. However, I feel that it is difficult to do without considering all the other factors that also play a part. After all, motivation to school is connected to multiple factors. In my talk, I will therefore try to give a more holistic view of the school situation in the Juvenile Unit and how it impacts motivation for learning. My talk will be mostly experience-based as opposed to a very theoretical view. What I want to do is to share with you my experiences and observations from working in the Juvenile Unit. My goal is to create an understanding of the challenges faced by the youths that we teach there and how we try to work with them. I'll also try to answer the following questions. Which conditions do we believe improve students' desire to learn? And in which situations do we see that the students are the most interested in school? A quick note on terminology before we begin. I usually refer to the children in the Juvenile Unit as students when talking about them in a teaching context and as inmates in a prison context. I'm referring to the same children. I hope this isn't confusing. My plan for this presentation is to begin by giving you some information about what the Juvenile Unit is. I will try as best as I can to say something in general about what I feel is a very disparate group of students. I have chosen to do so by giving a slightly simplified view of our teaching situation. I'll present an overview of some of the typical challenges faced when working with these students and explain how we try to motivate them based on those challenges. This will all be based on the personal experiences of me and some of my colleagues. And as previously mentioned, the goal of this is to try to say something about in which situations and under which conditions students show an increased interest in learning at the Juvenile Unit. So, first some facts about the Juvenile Unit. It is a high security unit of Bjørgvin prison with a capacity to house up to 4 inmates. The number of young inmates at the unit fluctuates. Sometimes there are only 1 or 2. Sometimes it is 4. This is partly because in Norway, children under the age of 18 can only be placed in protective custody for a maximum of 2 weeks. This leads to an unpredictable school and prison situations for both students, teachers, and prison officers, which I will talk more about later. One of the mottos used by the Juvenile Unit is that children shouldn't go to prison, but some children have to. In other words, there is an emphasis from the prison itself that being imprisoned is not a positive measure to take for children's development, yet some of them must be. Similarly, this is how I feel that we, the teachers, try to deal with the situation. The courts, police, and correctional service decide who my students are. We accept that the Juvenile Unit is maybe not the most beneficial place for these children to be, but we try to make the best of the situation. The unit also has a high rate of employees per inmate. There are normally about 2 employees per inmate, and the employees are roughly 50% prison officers and 50% social workers. They always dress in civilian clothing, and the unit itself barely looks like a prison, as you can see on the picture here. Apart from the reinforced doors and all the locks and furniture designed to stay attached to the wall at all costs, it looks more like a shared living space for children under the care of Child Protective Services. When it comes to the students, it is nigh impossible to make generalized statements about them all as a group, as each student arrives at the unit with his or her own story and challenges. Most of them have very complex needs. Many of them have deviant behaviors or behavior disorders, and many struggle with drugs, alcohol, and criminality. Many have a long history of encounters with the police and/or Child Protective Services already from a young age. Many of them have negative feelings towards school, as well as, and possibly resulting from few and bad experiences with the school system. Many of them also suffer from mental issues and trauma. Indeed, to many of them, being imprisoned, even if it's not for the first time, can be a trauma in and of itself, on top of the issues they may already have. So, in other words, it is not easy being an inmate at the Juvenile Unit. And this is before we have even begun talking about taking classes. All of this is not to be overly pessimistic about the state of our students, however. To many, school ends up being one of the few stable and consistent activities in an otherwise disorderly life at the unit. But when I will later talk about students struggling to get up in the morning, more or less every day of the week, hopefully you will understand a bit about why. So, what do we do as teachers? After arriving at the Juvenile Unit, all new students talk with our counselor. He identifies each student's needs, wishes and challenges, and with the student's consent, fetches information from their current school. Already at this point there are many individual adjustments to be made. Some students go to a school where teachers are very quick and thorough in giving us teaching plans and information about the students. Others are not so lucky. Sometimes we are completely in the dark in regards to students' educational progression, and we are forced to make the best out of the situation. Some students haven't showed up to school for a long time. What they all have in common, at least, is that starting schoolwork after having just been imprisoned is difficult. All students receive an individually tailored weekly plan and classes to suit their needs. For some, this is a fully packed plan where they take all the same classes that they would have if they were at their regular school in parallel. But this is not always the case. Most students cannot manage a full week of school when they arrive. Many have trouble sleeping and getting up in the morning, and school is not their first thought nor priority upon arriving in prison. Our wish, of course, is that the students should have as much school as possible. At the same time, we are a bit wary of pushing them too hard to begin with. We know that the youths that we teach, or children, are in a vulnerable place, both physically and mentally. They are also under pressure from home, prison officers, and elsewhere. If us teachers were to arrive in class with a very strict and demanding approach, it might end badly, in my opinion. I believe that we instead stand more to gain by making the students want to come to us. These are, after all, students who tend to suffer from what I call authority fatigue. They have enough grown-ups nagging them about what they should and shouldn't do during the day. To give you an example of this, I have had students who have been very clear about wanting school and talking about how important school is to them. But when it comes to the schedule, they almost had to pre-approve the weekly schedule, which tend to change from week to week. If one student had agreed beforehand to have Norwegian class with me on a Tuesday, it would be almost impossible to get him to even talk to me on the Tuesday. And when that's our starting point for some, it's difficult to force students to do anything at all. So when we make our weekly plans, we try to work with every student. We try to create a teaching week based on what they want, are motivated for, and can feasibly complete, while luring them into having progressively more schoolwork, of course. I believe that this type of involvement in your own school situation is positive in many ways. The degree to which these students have an influence over their own lives in prison is often very small. Therefore, it could be that being allowed to decide whether to do something is more motivating. At the same time, deliberately skipping a lesson that you personally agreed to having could be harder than one that was forced upon you. So some degree of autonomy or self-determination can be motivating for many students, I think. More or less, all of the classes at the Juvenile Unit is what we call 1-to-1, which means one teacher per student. This is partly for security reasons, but also for practical and pedagogical reasons. There are often big differences between students in terms of skill and level, in addition to the previously mentioned behavioral challenges. This being the normal teaching situation at the unit, I believe that one of the most important factors in motivating the students is the pedagogical relation that we have. The students can spend 4 to 5 hours or more together with one teacher every week. This is difficult if you don't get along. And I think that if you want to succeed in teaching one-on-one with the same student over time, you need to spend time building a good pedagogical relation. Take getting up for class in the morning, for example, which is one thing that many of our students tend to struggle with, understandably so, considering their situation really. The officers do not always get the desired response upon trying to wake up the youths. Occasionally, it happens that they will get up and come to class if the teacher comes to wake them instead. It is often easier to help a student get up if they know you well or are motivated to be in your class, especially if you can tolerate the odd string of profanity that can accompany a rejected attempt to help a student get up. I truly believe that building a good pedagogical relation is one of the most motivating things that we can do for the students at the juvenile unit, at least for many of those who have negative experiences with school. I want to give one example of this, a young inmate who completely refused any and all attempts to get him to have as much as a single class. He did not want anything put on his weekly plan, and he seemed suspicious of us teachers. My impression, by the way, is that many of the youths in the juvenile unit have a slightly troubled history with teachers, adults and authority figures, and are not always quick to trust. Anyway, the one thing that this boy did care for was playing football. So when I had breaks in my classes with another student, we would play football outside together. Sometimes I'd stay behind for 15 minutes after I had finished teaching to play with them. And after about a month, the young inmate finally agreed to having a small appointment with me. It was important to him that we could not write Norwegian class or school on his weekly plan, so we agreed to just call it an appointment instead. After our first appointment, we wrote down the rules to a game we'd been playing, and he agreed to having more and more appointments with me, and after a while some classes along with another student. So at this point I feel like my time investment is starting to pay off, and that a lot of the reason we are actually having classes together is due to me working on building that relation. And then of course I arrive at work one day to find that my student is no longer at the unit, which is incredibly frustrating, but unfortunately typical of the situation faced by both me and the students. There is a lot of unpredictability that we have to work with. There is a lot of insecurity for children in prison. My hypothesis is that this insecurity is the or one of the largest demotivating factors among the youths at the juvenile unit. I will try to explain what I mean by borrowing a concept from assessment theory, which states that the students faced with an assessment situation ask themselves 3 questions. 1, where am I? 2, where am I going? And 3, how am I going to get there? These are questions that should be answered by good teacher feedback. So when youths arrive at the juvenile unit, they are not always sure where they are. Most of them do not even know precisely where they are geographically. They don't know how long they are going to stay, other than the rule about protective custody not exceeding 2 weeks at a time. Of course, these things are often extended, but only for 2 weeks at a time. This is a very short time frame to plan ahead. Those who normally attend school outside of prison may not have been there in a while, or they are not there often enough to receive appropriate follow-up from teachers. So how can we expect them to be in control of their school situation? Should we expect them to get up at school up for school at 8 in the morning, which for many of them might even be a stretch to begin with, when they don't know where they will be in 2 weeks. Not knowing where you are makes it difficult to find a goal, an answer to the question, where am I going? In my experience, many of our students do not know what they want in life, where they want to go, or how to get there. Good school counseling is one thing that I have experienced the importance of. The school's role at the Juvenile Unit is not merely limited to teaching, but also to helping students find their way in life. In other words, good school counseling can possibly provide students with answers to where am I going and how am I going to get there. Giving students a clear path towards an achievable goal can certainly help motivate those who do not know where they are going. Our school counselor will find good solutions for the students. For example, signing them up for this course and that course, registering for that exam you need in order to get your certificate, or simply giving you that 3 or 4 year plan that will see you graduate with the opportunity to get a job afterwards. And I think we all realize the importance of education on recidivism. In 2015 in Norway, only 36% of adult inmates were working at the time they were incarcerated, and 66% of inmates had not completed an upper secondary education. For those students who are only in protective custody and whose stay at the unit is shorter, it might also be useful to focus on the usefulness of going to school here. When communication with their regular school is good, we are sometimes able to frame their stay at the unit as an opportunity to get extra help with the work that they are currently doing at their regular school. And this ends up being quite motivating for some. Another massive challenge for almost all students is sleep, as previously mentioned. We see that many of the youths here tend to stay up during the night and sleep until noon or longer. They often struggle both with falling asleep and with waking up. This is not necessarily surprising, given the fact that many might be dealing with mental issues and trauma on top of being in prison as a child. But it emphasizes the importance of motivating this group of students. We are not merely trying to motivate them to work harder in class or learn more, we are motivating them to come to class at all or to get up in the first place. So finally, some words about students' feelings towards school in general. Many of the youths who arrive at the unit have few and/or bad experiences with school. Many of them have lost out on a lot of school, either because of truancy or other factors. Many or most have not succeeded at school as a result of behavioral challenges or learning challenges. And while teaching one-to-one sounds like a good opportunity on paper to give these students a lot of extra help, working one-to-one is also very difficult. In Norway, there has been a tendency for struggling students to be taken out of class for a one-on-one lesson with an assistant, for example. There is a clear social stigma to being taken out of class in this manner, and I am not convinced that enough of these lessons provide children with an adequate experience of mastery. I have been told by a lot of my students at the Juvenile Unit that they, quote, hate being taught one-to-one, and that it brings back bad memories from school. And speaking of mastery, my impression is also that many of the children who arrive at the unit have a low sense of what we call self-efficacy. Briefly explained and possibly overly simplified, self-efficacy is the belief that one has in one's ability to succeed at a given task, often based on past experiences. In other words, students with low self-efficacy often perceive challenges at school as threats and trying to avoid them rather than trying, while a student with high self-efficacy might believe that he or she will succeed in a challenge and therefore have an easier time trying. A lot of our students have a long history of not succeeding at school and have repeatedly been told that they do not master neither the educational nor the social aspects of school. As a consequence, they often do not expect to succeed in these areas either. I am therefore a big proponent of praise. My suspicion is that the students who we have at the Juvenile Unit have received significantly less praise than their law-abiding peers. Of course, the previously mentioned pedagogical relation also plays a role here. I do not think that praising students has quite the same effect if given by someone the student does not have a good relation to. When we praise students for succeeding, working well, or just showing up and trying, they should know that we mean what we say. Not to say that we are constantly praising every little thing that our students do, of course, but a little goes a long way. As it is without a doubt difficult to be in prison as a child, we try to provide them with some good and positive school experiences when and where we can. And to add to this, I also see a tendency that those students who love school the most rarely are the ones who end up at the Juvenile Unit. And that's why one of the things that we often focus on in our work here is for the youths to learn to go to school. In other words, completely simple things that we tend to take for granted with other students. It can be using a textbook, answering a task, sitting in class and working for 45 minutes, following a weekly plan, doing one piece of homework, or reading a short text. These are skills that many students unfortunately struggle with when they come to us. We need to teach them these skills, but above all, make them believe that school is something they can do and succeed at. They need to believe that school is something they should prioritize in their lives and to get up and show up for. This means building good school experiences and giving students the belief that school is not only important, but something they can do. They need to learn how to go to school, but also how to succeed at school. For many, this is a process that starts with very small steps, but that hopefully in time leads them closer to a goal. So, to summarize, I want to emphasize how complex the challenges that I have talked about here are. I know that there are plenty of other factors playing a part than those I have mentioned, both in terms of motivational theory and other things. These are, after all, tendencies that I have observed, and they can often vary a lot from student to students, as it is in schools in general. There is no one answer to the question how to teach young students in prison, but this is what I'm trying to focus on at the Juvenile Unit in Bjørgvin. Boosting self-efficacy, or believing in yourself that you will succeed in challenges if you simply try. Praising, which requires a good pedagogical relation. And giving students some degree of control and self-determination in an environment where they might feel a lack of control. I hope that I have been able to give you a depiction of what life is like at the Juvenile Unit, and that I have accurately represented the work that we do there. Thank you for listening.